You know what this is for about you. There are moments in life you don't realize are turning points, until everything after them feels different. And maybe that's why you're here. Because something about her didn't just attract you, it stayed with you. Not in the usual way, not like a passing thought or a fleeting crush, but like a quiet echo that refuses to leave your mind, even when the day is over and the room is finally silent. Before we go further, if this resonates even a little, you might want to stay with me here. And yes, you can like and subscribe if you choose, but only if this feels like something worth coming back to. No pressure, just presence. Now listen to me carefully. I don't think you lost control of your emotions the way people casually say online. It's not that simple. What actually happens, what most men never get told, is that sometimes you meet someone who mirrors a part of you that was waiting to be seen. Not fixed, not saved, just seen. And when that happens, your mind doesn't behave normally anymore. You start replaying conversations that seemed ordinary at the time. You remember the way she paused before she answered you, the way she looked at you when she thought you weren't paying attention. And suddenly, those small fragments start feeling meaningful, heavy even. But here's where it gets complicated. It's not always about her. Sometimes it's about what she awakened in you. I've spoken to men who insist she was different. And I believe them, but not in the way they think. Because often, different isn't about her being rare in the world. It's about her unlocking a version of you that you don't usually live in. A more open version, a more honest one. A version that doesn't perform or protect itself so much. And once you've felt that version of yourself, your nervous system remembers. That's the part nobody warns you about. Not the attraction itself, but the imprint. So you start to feel a strange contradiction. On one hand, you want closeness. On the other, you feel slightly undone by it. Like something inside you has been stirred awake, but doesn't know where to go now. And if she pulled away, even a little, your mind doesn't interpret it as distance. It interprets it as unfinished. That's where the looping begins. The replaying. The subtle obsession that doesn't feel like obsession, it feels like meaning. Like there's something still there that you need to understand. But I want you to hold something gently in your mind as we go deeper into this. Not everything that stays with you is meant to be returned to. Some things enter your life not to be repeated, but to reveal something about how deeply you can feel when you stop holding yourself back. And I think that's where your story actually begins. There's a specific kind of silence that follows someone like her leaving your space. It's not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It just lingers. You'll be doing something ordinary, checking your phone, driving, half listening to a conversation, and suddenly she's there again in your mind. Not as a full memory, more like a sensation, a feeling of unfinished emotional business that doesn't have a clear language. And this is where most men misinterpret what's happening inside them. They assume it means, I need her back. But what I often see, sitting across from men in moments like this, is something more subtle. It's not always about wanting the person. It's about wanting the version of yourself that existed when she was still emotionally close. Because when someone touches you in a way that bypasses your usual defenses, your humor, your logic, your detachment, you don't just remember them. You remember you. And that can be disorienting. You might notice things like this. You start over-analyzing what you said. You question whether you were enough in certain moments. You replay your tone, your timing, your silence. And without realizing it, you begin constructing a narrative where you are trying to solve something that was never meant to be solved, like a puzzle. But attraction, real emotional impact, doesn't behave like a problem with a solution. It behaves like an imprint, and imprints don't respond well to logic. They respond to time, distance, and acceptance. Still, there's another layer here that most people avoid looking at. Sometimes, when someone stays in your thoughts this persistently, it's because they represented a moment where you felt emotionally exposed. Not weak, not broken, just exposed in a way you don't usually allow. Maybe you said something more honest than you normally would. Maybe you looked at them longer than you intended. Maybe you felt seen in a way that made you slightly uncomfortable. because it bypassed the version of you that you present to the world. And here's the quiet truth that rarely gets spoken. When someone witnesses you without your usual armor, even briefly, your mind tags that experience as significant. Not necessarily because they are the one, but because you were real in their presence. And real moments don't fade cleanly, they echo. So now you're stuck between two internal forces. One part of you wants closure, wants clarity, wants a clean emotional ending so you can move forward. And another part of you doesn't actually want it to end at all, because ending it would mean letting go of something that made you feel more awake than your everyday life usually allows. And that tension, that quiet internal conflict, is often what keeps the attachment alive long after the actual connection has changed. Not her, but the version of you she briefly unlocked. There's a moment in almost every story like this where the mind starts rewriting history without permission. You know what I mean? You begin to elevate small moments. A simple conversation starts to feel like it had hidden meaning. A glance feels heavier than it probably was. A pause in texting turns into a question mark you can't stop circling. And I want you to notice something carefully here, not to judge it, just to see it clearly. Your mind isn't trying to torture you, it's trying to complete a pattern that feels emotionally unfinished. Because when someone impacts you deeply, but doesn't fully resolve into your life in a stable, ongoing way, the brain does something very human. It searches for coherence. It tries to turn emotional intensity into story, into meaning, into something that makes sense. But not everything that feels intense is meant to become a story you continue living inside. Sometimes it's just a moment of heightened emotional sensitivity between two people who briefly collided at the right time, in the wrong structure. And that's where men often get caught. Not in the connection itself, but in the interpretation of it. I've seen this pattern enough to recognize its shape. A man meets someone who responds to him with warmth, presence, or emotional depth that he hasn't felt in a while. Maybe not even from her specifically, but from that version of interaction. The kind where you don't feel like you're performing, or being evaluated, or filtered through expectations. And for a brief time, the nervous system relaxes. That relaxation can feel like destiny if you're not used to it. But here's where it becomes psychologically interesting. The same system that relaxes in her presence can become agitated in her absence. Not because something was taken from you, but because your internal equilibrium shifted and didn't fully reset. So your mind keeps reaching back. Not because she is actively pulling you, but because your system is still trying to find the state it briefly experienced. And that's the part that can quietly turn into obsession if you don't recognize it early enough. Not loud obsession, quiet obsession. The kind that looks like reflection, but slowly becomes repetition. And I want to say something gently here because this is where men often turn against themselves. You don't need to shame yourself for feeling this, but you also don't want to romanticize it. Because there's a difference between meaningful emotional impact and unresolved emotional looping. One expands your awareness of yourself, the other narrows your attention until everything starts pointing back to a single person. And the truth is, what you're really searching for in moments like this is not just her. It's the feeling of emotional openness that existed around her. The version of you that didn't feel the need to be guarded every second. That's what your mind keeps returning to. Not the person as she is in full reality, but the emotional state she represented inside you. And once you can see that distinction clearly, something begins to loosen. Not instantly, but honestly. And that honesty is where the next shift begins. There's a point in this kind of emotional experience where something subtle changes. And most men don't notice it until they're already deep in it. The thoughts stop being just memories. They start becoming questions about yourself. Not just, what is she doing, or does she think about me? But something quieter, more internal. Why did I feel that strongly? Why her? Why do I still care? And underneath those questions is usually something even more vulnerable. What does this say about me? This is where the emotional weight shifts, because now it's no longer about the connection alone. It becomes a mirror you keep looking into, trying to understand what it reflected back. And I want to slow this down with you, because this part is where men often start assigning meaning that doesn't actually belong to the situation. You begin to believe that intensity equals significance, that because you felt deeply, it must have been meant to become something permanent. But emotional intensity doesn't always point forward. Sometimes it points inward. Sometimes it reveals how long you've been functioning in a controlled, emotionally filtered way, and how powerful it feels when that control loosens, even briefly. And if you're not used to that softness in yourself, you might unconsciously attach it to the person who happened to be present when it surfaced. Not because she created it, but because she was there when you stopped suppressing it. That distinction matters more than people realize, because if you confuse the trigger with the source, you'll keep chasing the wrong thing. You'll think you're chasing her presence, when you're actually chasing your own emotional openness. And here's where it gets even more delicate. If she pulled away, or even just became less available, your mind may interpret that shift as something meaningful about your worth, as if the distance itself is a message. But often, distance is just distance. Two people not aligning in timing, emotional readiness, or life structure. Not a verdict, not a hidden statement, just reality doing what reality does. Still, your internal world doesn't always accept that easily, because part of you is still holding on to the emotional state she activated in you, and it doesn't want to let go of it without replacing it with something equal. That's why distraction doesn't fully work. That's why logic doesn't fully work, because neither of them replaces emotional resonance. Only time and self-reconnection do. And this is the uncomfortable truth I've seen again and again. You don't actually resolve this by getting answers from her. You resolve it by becoming someone who can hold that emotional openness within himself, without needing a specific person to trigger it. That's the shift most men never consciously make. They stay external, searching, when the real movement is internal, reclaiming. And I think somewhere inside you already know that. Even if part of you still resists it, there's a quiet moment that eventually arrives in experiences like this, though it doesn't feel quiet when you're in it. It feels like contradiction. One day you notice something strange. The emotional charge isn't as sharp as it used to be. Her name doesn't hit your mind with the same urgency. The replay of old conversations doesn't pull you in as deep. But instead of relief, there's something more complicated underneath. A kind of emptiness. Not because she was meant to stay, but because your mind got used to orbiting something that once felt emotionally alive. And when that orbit starts to loosen, you're left facing something most men avoid recognizing. The intensity was never just about her. It was about how alive you felt in relation to her. And now, without that constant emotional activation, you're left with yourself again. No reflection, no stimulation, no internal narrative pulling you forward. Just you. And that's where the real work quietly begins. Though it doesn't feel like work, it feels like adjustment. Like learning to sit in your own emotional space without needing it to be filled by memory, possibility, or longing. I want to be careful here because this isn't about moving on in the way people casually say it online. This is about something more subtle. Reclaiming emotional neutrality without numbing yourself. Because a lot of men swing too far after experiences like this. They either stay emotionally attached in loops, or they shut down completely, telling themselves they don't want to feel anything like that again. But both extremes miss the point. What actually matters is learning that emotional depth is not dangerous just because it became uncomfortable in one specific situation. You don't need to avoid depth. You need to learn how to hold it without losing your center. And that takes awareness of what was real, what was projection, and what was simply your own capacity for connection waking up in a way it hadn't before. Because yes, something did happen. You weren't imagining that. You were impacted. But impact is not ownership. And meaning doesn't always equal permanence. Sometimes a person enters your life briefly not to complete a story, but to show you a version of yourself you had not fully been living as. A version that feels more open, more emotionally available, more present. And once you've seen that version, you don't actually go back to who you were before. You integrate it, slowly, imperfectly, in real life, not in thought loops. So if there's anything to take from this, it isn't her. It isn't the outcome. It isn't even the why. It's this. You're capable of deeper emotional presence than you usually allow yourself to live in. And once that's been awakened, it doesn't disappear. It just asks to be expressed in healthier, steadier places, with people who can meet it fully, and with a life that doesn't require emotional loss to prove emotional depth. Because what touched you wasn't just her, it was you, finally feeling something without holding yourself back from it. And that's not something you need to chase, it's something you learn to live from.